Okay, so I want to start off with just talking a little bit about, we've heard a few questions here about what's coming into this country, how they're getting here, how many species are here, that kind of thing. This is a little snapshot of some data that was taken from an APHIS database. APHIS is responsible for identifying and keeping track of all the species that come into the ports. And during this 15-year time period, about 15 or so years ago, 15, 20 years ago, in this database there were 600,000 pest interceptions. Beetles were the fourth most common order of insects that are being intercepted. The other ones, some of them like flies and some of the Homoptera type things were number 1 and 2. But the most commonly intercepted beetle family, or subfamily, or whatever you want to call it now, are the bark beetles. And 68,000 bark beetles themselves. So about 10% of the interceptions were bark beetles across a number of different genera, 49 different genera. So lots of beetles are coming into this country, lots of bark beetles, and they're being intercepted all over the country. Even Iowa has one interception of a bark beetle. So, but as you can guess, most of these things are intercepted at the ports along the coast, Florida, California, Texas, Georgia, where there are the major ports. That doesn't mean that that's their end point. These things get maybe intercepted there, put on a rail car, those cargo ships, those cargo containers, and get moved all around the country. So the point is here that this is a problem that's been going on for a while. Lots of different species, lots of different locations. And again, this is, as Jerry said, only about 2% of the material that comes in gets intercepted. So if you say 600,000 and 2% of the cargo, multiply that by 98 something, and you get a really big number of insects coming into this country, a lot of them being undetected. So what about bark beetles? And I mentioned 49 different genera. Well, there's about 6,000 species worldwide. We have 560 or so if you're a lumper or a splitter, 570, 550, somewhere on there already in this country. 62% of those, or 62 of those 560 are non-native species. Species that have come in from all over the world, a lot from Asia, some from Europe in the older days. The point of this slide is this is not a new phenomenon, although it's an increasingly important phenomenon or issue. The first non-native bark beetle that was identified in North America was from 1816, and it was an Ambrosia beetle found in New England. Probably was here way before 1816. It was just identified then. But in that time period, from 1816 to 1980, there were 30 or so bark beetles, non-natives, found in this country. Since then, just in the past, it's hard to believe 1980 was like 30-something years ago, but since then, we've more than doubled that number. 62 species are here now. Actually, it's probably more like 64. Again, if you want to throw in a couple that are just trying to figure out what they are. Maybe there's Fornicatus and maybe there's another species. So maybe 63, 64. This is, again, just graphically showing 1816 and then all the way to actually 2010. That number should be bumped up to 6 or 7 or something like that. So you can see the increasing rate of establishments of these non-native bark beetles. This is the list of species that have been intercepted or established since 1980. You see lots of different names and lots of different genera. The point here is just to show you that there's lots of beetles coming in that have lots of different habits. Some of these are pine-infesting species. Tomicus pinniperta, there was a lot of concern that that was going to be a major pest. So far, it hasn't turned out to be. Our friend Uwelacea is in there. There's a few others that were potentially serious pests. Some of them have turned out to be aggressive, some of them not so much. I'll show you again that slide later. But out of that 62, almost half, 28, are ambrosia beetles. There's a good number of these seed and twig beetles that feed on, small twigs of various trees and plants. Some of them feed just on seeds. There's a whole genus, Cocotripes, that feeds on seeds of various trees or other plants. And then some of the true bark beetles like this Tomicus pinniperta, the pine shoot beetle, or the European elm bark beetle. But most of the things that are here are these ambrosia beetles. And Yuri touched on this a little bit, but ambrosia beetles come in lots of different sizes and shapes and forms. I think some of the coolest beetles, the one up in the upper left up there, his name is Amputatus, very appropriately named. So some of them with big satellite dish-looking antenna, some of them with big scooped-out heads there. So lots of different sizes and shapes. But the ones we're talking about, this is actually one of the slides that Yuri showed. Again, this ambrosial habit has arisen many times within the bark beetle family. But the ones we're talking about are on the ones on top there, the Xylobarini. And there are about 1,200 species worldwide. Most of them are in the tropics, but there's a good number also in areas other than the tropics across the world. So it's a very successful lifestyle, if you will, this feeding on the fungus. So in North America, what do we have as far as that group of ambrosia beetles, the Xylobarini? I don't know if you can see down the bottom here, but there's 46 species in the United States and Canada at this point. 26 of those are non-natives. Okay? I mentioned before that there are 28 ambrosia beetles. There's a couple in another family, another tribe. So a variety of different genera here. Some genera that are here the only representatives are non-native species. Some of them, like Xylobris, there's a pretty good number of natives that are here. And each of these has various numbers of species. Dryasitoides, Coptoborus, there's only one species, and they're apparently pretty native, but they occur like in Florida. And if you looked at this list just 10 years ago, it would have been shrunk down to maybe 3 different genera here. People like Yuri keep on splitting this up into making more names, And a lot of these are newly found. So I'll come back to that list too. So again, Yuri touched on this a little bit. What makes these Liberines so successful in invading new habits? Well, they have the skewed sex ratio. They have the symmating. So all you need is really a piece of wood with one female in it, and she can establish a new population. Again, there's the male and the female. We heard about their inbreeding and that sort of stuff, symmating. They also have a broad host range. So, if you're a pine infesting species like, say, the pine shoot beetle, and you land in the port of Long Beach, you might not have many pine trees around here to find a good host to attack. But if you're an ambrosia beetle, sometimes you don't care what that host is as long as it has some xylem to grow the fungus. So a broad host range, and they often do well. Like I said, they're in the tropics a lot. So they often do well in most of the species in North America or in the warm, humid climates. California maybe being the exception. So I showed you this list before of what's been introduced here since 1980. The ones that are in white are all ambrosia beetles. Okay? So again, the majority of things that are getting here are the ambrosia beetles. So, okay, so we have 62 non-native bark beetles in the United States. How many of those are what would you call important? Well, and I'm using important maybe in a very broad sense here. Anasandrus dispar was that first one that was found in the United States in 1816. It probably came across with the colonists or some of the early trade that we had with Europe. It infests fruit trees, and it's distributed pretty much across the northern United States, from New England to Washington State and Oregon. In fact, in the Northwest, it's more of a pest than it is in the Northeast. It attacks fruit trees, and it causes some problems there. The second one there, Xylobarinus saxesini, is in, I think, 49 states. The only one it's not in is Alaska. It is probably the most common ambrosia beetle you'll find across the whole country. You put a trap up with ethanol, you're going to get that species almost no matter where you are. It's doing something out there. I've seen it occasionally hit nursery stock and that sort of thing, maybe newly transplanted trees. Not a real aggressive species, but it's certainly making a living across the country, doing pretty well because it's all over the place. Sclitus multistriatus, probably maybe the most damaging of the non-native bark beetles we have up to this point. Of course, the vector of Dutch elm disease. These other two, Xylosandrus compactus and Crassiusculus, also have had an impact nursery stock. I've seen them attacking and killing saplings in nurseries, occasionally an aggressive species. Being an ambrosia beetle, they also carry fungus with them. Tomicus pinaperta, again, came here, found here with a lot of hype. We thought it was going to cause problems, but so far it hasn't been doing very much damage. We've heard the next one, Xylibris glabratus, that's the one the red bay ambrosia beetle that's vectoring laurel wilt, and we'll hear a lot more about that in the next day or two. and our friend Euolacea fornicatus, and Scolitis chevirui. I have that on the list. That's another relatively new find, although it's probably been here for years. I think it's up to maybe 20 or 30 states now.
28.
28, there you go, and Mexico.
Yeah, Mexico.
And that attacks elms. Is it vectoring Dutch elm disease? Maybe not, but maybe some other fungus. So one thing that you might see here is that, okay, we got a lot of Ambrosia beetles, and the ones that are not Ambrosia beetles that are causing problems like Multistratus and chevirui may be vectoring fungi. So it's not just the beetles themselves in this case that makes these beetles important, it's the fungus-beetle association. That often is the case. And Tomicus pinniperta is the pine shoot beetle. So it breeds in dying, dead logs and trees. And then as an adult, it flies to the twigs or the shoots of healthy pine trees and feeds there. So far, it hasn't picked up any nasty fungi, but that kind of habit could certainly lead to this beetle, if it does pick up the right fungus, start to cause lots of mortality. So one to keep your eye on, I think, but so far not causing any problems. So that brings us to our friend Euolacea. That is what we're calling fornicatus there. I showed this slide before. There are 3 species of Euolacea in this country now, 3 or 4 or whatever we're going to find out in the next year or so. What's known about that genus, there's about 60 species worldwide. 3 of them in the US, the Validus and Interjectus. Now you may have already heard that Validus is here, but Interjectus is probably here too, and this is maybe some lessons to be learned with this Validus Interjectus. Those 2 species are kind of this longer, more elongate species of Euolacea, as we'll look at fornicatus next, is a little bit stouter. But for years, everything that we had in the United States is called Validus. And we're just realizing now that probably Interjectus has been here quite a while too. It seems to be more in the southeast, and Validus is a little bit more widely distributed in the east, but mostly in the northeast. So that, keep in mind the shape of that Validus, kind of a longer, thinner, as opposed to what we're calling fornicatus, which is a much stouter beetle. The ratio of the pronotum, the first segment there, to the elytra is much, much different than these longer Validus and Interjectus species. So there are, so question mark in California, if it's fornicatus or not. So there are a number of species in the genus Euolacea that have that stout body form. None of them are in the United States, except for fornicatus or whatever. So we have fornicatus up here. There's Adamanensis, Xanthopus, and Velatus. All have that kind of stout body form. And I'll go through some of the, these are pictures of beetle butts, okay? The ends of the elytra, the declivity, this is called. And a lot of the action for identification is going on in that part, at least for this genus. So the first one we have is Euolacea adamanensis. This is pretty distinct, different than fornicatus. And its distribution, again, as are most of these Euolacea, occur in southeastern Asia. This one really hasn't moved around the world very much. If you look at that, it's different than what we're calling fornicatus. The little tubercles or denticles there are a little bit different, a lot more of them, a lot bigger, a little bit more of a difference on the very bottom down there. And there's some differences also on the head and the pronotum. So that one I think is pretty clear that we don't have. This one is also very close to fornicatus. Velatus, much more limited distribution in southeastern Asia. It's kind of hard to see on this picture, but let's see if I could do this without, here we go. So right around here, you'll notice in the next few pictures of fornicatus that this is more of a ridge as opposed to these little tubercles that end at the end of the elytra there. So this one, again, pretty distinctive, and I think what we have is different from that species. Now this one, Euolacea xanthopus, again, a pretty wide distribution. Actually, one of the species that occur in Africa. And there's about maybe 25 or so Euolacea that occur in Africa. The rest occur in Asia. This one, a wide distribution, but as I'll show you in the next slide, it has a lot of synonyms. And so a lot of things that may be this species, maybe being called the species are different. But this particular specimen has a reddish color to it. And remember before I mentioned about this ridge here, and Fornicatus and this species both have this ridge as opposed to little teeth along there. This is probably getting way too into the weeds here, but just giving you some ideas of the characters that we're looking at. So again, I mentioned all the different synonyms for this. The one that I took that image of is this rudis here, but there are lots of other ones. And when I spoke with Roger Beaver, who's another expert in this group, he thinks that some of these synonymies are probably not very good. The ones in Africa may in fact be very different species than the ones that occur in Asia. So, you know, what these populations look like, what these different synonyms look like, it's really anybody's guess. I only am able to look at the ones that are at the Smithsonian, and the only ones I've seen are rudis and semi-rudis, I think, or Xanthopus itself, yeah? So that brings us to our friend Fornicatus here. So Fornicatus was described in 1868 by Eickhoff, and the specimens he received, I believe, were from Sri Lanka. It has a wide distribution across a good part of Asia into North America, Costa Rica, as well as Panama. It's moved around the Pacific Islands quite a bit, as well as in Australia. And it too has a lot of synonyms. So as I said, Eickhoff described it in 1868. Then Eggers came along and thought up the great name Fornicadier. He wasn't very, anyway. So he described that from Sri Lanka also. And he thought it was significantly different morphologically, that he said it's a different species and it occurs on tea. That species he described, he said, is only on tea. What Eickhoff's specimens came from, we're not sure. Was it in Sri Lanka and attacking other species of trees there? We're not quite sure. But this is actually Eggers' specimen of Fornicadier. Unfortunately, it's not a very good specimen. It has lots of schmutz. Is that a technical word on the elytra there? And it's hard to see some of the features that may distinguish this from Fornicatus. But so that's Fornicadier. And then Shadle came along in the 40s and 50s and found what he thought were different species. I think he probably knew Eickhoff specimens. Unfortunately, Eickhoff's type specimen is lost. It was destroyed in Germany. So we don't have that to compare the type to. But anyway, Shadle came along and he said, well, he got this species. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that name. It's from Malaysia. And then 2 species from the Philippines and another one from Samoa. And if you look at all those, Steve Wood decided that they're all the same, and they're all Fornicatus. So do we have any of these? It's hard to say. That one from Malaysia is only known from the type specimen from Malaysia. One specimen, he described the species, nobody's seen it again. I don't think there's too many specimens of the other synonyms also. So as Yuri was saying, these things are semi-clonal, if you will. What we have in Samoa, maybe just a different race, whatever, from what's in Sri Lanka, and what we have here may be very different too. So again, looking at some of the parts of the beetle that all the identification features are on, these are what we're calling Fornicatus from the different parts of the world. Sri Lanka, Thailand, Hawaii, and they're pretty similar. The characters you want to look at are the punctures, the size of the punctures, some of the little denticles that are there, and some of these are at a little different angles, so it's kind of hard to see them too well. The slope, I forgot to mention with that reddish one, Xanthopus, the slope is not quite as concave as these Fornicatus. It's a little bit more, I wouldn't say, not as convex. These are very convex. The other one's a little bit more concave. So those are, again, features you look at. All these seem to have that consistent shape and tubercles. And so these are the ones from Florida, Israel, and California again. Can you imagine that there's some differences there? Yeah, maybe. Maybe these little punctures a little bit bigger. Maybe, you know, the denticles don't go down as far, that kind of thing. But, you know, there's nothing that's jumping out here that's saying that, yes, this is morphologically a distinct species. So lots of these images were taken by Steve and Jim at the Oregon Department of Ag. I want to thank them, Lisa and Nat at the Smithsonian, and Roger Beaver for his input on some of these species identifications. So I think we'll probably have some time for some questions. If not, yep. Okay. Yes?
Is fornicatus causing widespread damage in Florida as well?
I should ask Randy or Jason or someone from Florida to answer that.
You're talking about avocado? Or? Well, are you picking
right.
up damage because of tree season?
Okay, we are picking up from avocado, but trees that are affected by barrel root.
Go ahead, Randy. Just, it was first reported on Royal Ponciana, Delonix, Virginia. Apparently on that, Jason's been getting specimens from dead branches. I mean, there's a lot we don't know.
Yeah, we've recovered Fusarium from Royal Ponciana. It was also affected by Dualacia apparently, but unfortunately, when we recovered it at the time, we didn't keep tracking as a potential issue because Fusarium Delonix is still on and BNP isolates. But we're in the process of getting new ones so we can take a look at them carefully. But now that we know a little bit more what to look for on that rear, we'll obviously spend more time looking at something.
My questions?
It's more just a statement on.
So in the genetic work that we've been doing, when we put these into a tree, and the California specimens actually come out closer to Xanthopus than they do to Fornicatus. So if you can comment on that, I don't know.
I'm sorry?
Sorry. So in our genetic work, and this is just based on the CO1 sequences, the California material actually comes out closer to Xanthopus than it does to Fornicatus.
Yeah.
That seems to be what you're telling us, is that there's probably quite a few cryptic species in that whole group.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
You know, that specimen of Xanthopus that I had is pretty distinctive from Fornicatus. It has a different shape to the declivity, but that's just that one synonym, if you will, or one, you know. There could be other things that are being called Xanthopus that look very different from that. But somebody along the way said, oh, they're all the same. And that's quite often not a good synonymy. You know, Tom and I and Jerry, we've all separated resurrected species names that we thought were not good synonyms, and they turn out to be very distinctive species. So that's totally possible, yes.
Quick question, if I may. Where was that specimen from? And how did you manage to identify it?
The Xanthopus sequence is just a genmark specimen, so we'll have to check the genmark section.
Yeah, I think Jerry raised a good point. Who did the ID?
That's a good point. Genmark is as good as the data for genmark.
Yeah.
This is a bit of a comment, but given that it is just a patchwork of clones, or that seems to be the situation, whether we should therefore be considering a sort of a new form of taxonomy where you include the haplotype in the sort of the taxonomy, or in terms of sort of being able to predict the biology of the organism, perhaps the sort of the haplotype is most informative.
Yeah, I don't want to become a fungal taxonomist for a species that has two names, but I see what you're saying, yeah.
For purposes of outreach, at this moment we desperately need to have a Latin name to this, and just for all our posters, all kind of test sheets and all this stuff. Can we name